Hello, I am Dr. Kulkarni, and this presentation deals with the scientific paper writing. The general guidelines include that the paper should be a plain white paper, a bond paper of the size of 8.5 into 11 inches. One should type on one side only. One should not use both sides of the paper for printing. The font size for the main text should be 10 to 12. For the title, the font size should be 14 and it should be bold. And for the subtitle, the font size should be 12 and bold. The printing should be done on a laser printer and it should be of a letter quality. The spacing used in the sentences for the main text should be double spacing. The margins should be 1.5 inches on the left side, other margins could be 1 inches. One should, in addition to this, one should look for the guidelines given in the instructions to the writers in the journal website or in a journal issue. So there you should write. Some of the instructions may differ as far as these headings are concerned, but these are the general guidelines. But one should look for the specific instructions in the journal to which you are proposing the article to be sent. The contents of the paper can be broadly divided into these headings. The first is the title of the page, then the second is the abstract and the keywords, then comes the introduction, then come the result, references, and the acknowledgement. And we will discuss each of these headings in further details. The titles, as far as possible, should be exactly as approved by the Institutional Ethics Committee. This is not a rigid rule, but as far as possible, it should be as approved by the Ethics Committee. It should not be too much deviating from what the Ethics Committee has given you permission about. Then it should be short and self-explanatory. The title should be short and self-explanatory. One doesn't expect a title which is 4 or 5 lines in the paper. So it should be short and self-explanatory. It should contain the keywords. The title should contain the keywords. This is because with the proper keywords, your paper can be easily found by the persons in the internet. If it is published in the journal, with the help of the keywords, the persons searching for the articles can easily find your article. So choose of appropriate keywords in the title is a very important thing. The keywords should be as per mesh terminology. Mesh terminology is the word given by the PubMed, and the mesh means medical subject headings. So you should go to PubMed and find out the appropriate mesh equivalents for the words that you are using as the keywords. They may be common man's terms, but they should be converted into mesh terminology. Then you should mention study design in the title, especially if it is a randomized control trial. We expect, if it is a randomized control trial, we expect that the mention that it is a randomized control trial should be there in the title. Other studies can also, in other studies also, you can think of giving the study design in the title, that is case control study. If it is a case control study, in the end, you may mention that your study is a case control study in the title itself. This again helps the searchers on the net to search for your article. Then comes the abstract, which is a very important component of the research publication. You must use past tense in the references, and you must use the keywords in the abstracts also. Uh, One has to use the mesh terminology as it was used in the titles. The similar method should be adopted for taking appropriate mesh equivalents for the common terms. Then one should mention the background and the objectives. The abstract could be divided into these parts, that is the background and objectives, then material and methods, results and important conclusions. Many journals expect structured abstract to be given. Structured abstract means you give a subtitle in the abstract as background and objectives, and then mention background and objectives in the brief. Then you write down or type material and methods, and then you mention briefly the material and methods used in your study in the abstract. Then you type results, and the same thing is repeated for the results, and so on. So this is called the structured abstract. The structured abstract is preferable because you are less likely to lose anything unmentioned or leave anything unmentioned in the abstract. Some journals expect structured abstract, some journals do not expect structured abstract. Then comes the introduction. In the introduction, you must mention why did you do it, means why did you undertake that study. So that must be the crux of the introduction. You must mention the background in the brief. If it is a clinical trial, then briefly you must give an overview of the currently available treatments for that disease. So that must be given in very brief. Then come the rationale as to why the study was required. If it is a clinical trial, why the clinical trial that you undertook was necessary. If it is a case control study, why the case control study was required. So that reason must be given, and giving the reason of the study is mentioning the rationale of the study. The rationale could be explanatory or it could be pragmatic. Explanatory is something like assessing the effect of a new drug. So this explains in words or sentences the rationale of the study. It could be pragmatic, like to guide the practitioner on risk factors of a disease. So rationale could be given in explanatory form or it could be given in pragmatic form depending on the type of the study. Justification must be given on the grounds of novelty and relevance. What was new? What is new in your study? And what is the relevance of your study? So these must be mentioned as far as possible in the introduction itself, because many people will decide whether to read the entire article or not after reading the introduction. So in introduction, if these points are forcefully made, that is the novelty and the relevance of your study, then the reader is more likely to read the article in details and the complete article will be read. If the in the introduction the rationale doesn't come out forcefully as far as the novelty and the relevance is concerned, then the reader is less likely to read your article. A mention must also be made about the knowledge gap that is filled by the study. So what knowledge gap is filled? If it is a case control study, you may mention as to there is less knowledge about the risk factors for a particular disease. If it is a clinical trial, you may mention that the current drugs are there, but there are certain shortcomings of the drug. And what shortcomings of the currently used treatment, that can be mentioned briefly. So these are the knowledge gaps that are filled by the study, which should come in the introduction. Then few pertinent references of similar studies. Persons might have conducted similar studies. They may be available in the reference, available for you and others. Those must be mentioned. So those must be pertinent only in introduction. So pertinent references which are similar to your studies must be mentioned in the introduction. And lastly, you must mention the objectives and hypotheses. Some journals expect the objectives and hypotheses to be mentioned separately, while some do not expect it to be mentioned in separately. So in that situation, the objectives and hypotheses must be mentioned in the end in the introduction. Then comes objectives and research question and hypothesis if they are not mentioned in the introduction separately, and if the journals expect these to be mentioned separately. So it mentions briefly what did you want it to do. So that is briefly mentioned in the objectives. So do not include the step as an objective. A step in the study should not be mentioned as an objective. It could be derived from the research question. Your research question, for example, could be to research question could be whether the new drug has less side effect than the established line of treatment. So that is your research question. So objective is to this research question can be converted into objective something like this, that to find whether the new drug has got lesser side effects than the established drug or established line of treatment. So that is how a research question can be converted into objective. The objectives could be mentioned. and they must indicate the research question and objectives must indicate the primary variables and the population or the participants. Who were the participants and what were the primary variables that must come in the research question. If it is not mentioned in the research question, of the indication of that is not given in the research question, the research question needs to be revised. Then hypothesis is required for analytical and experimental studies, and one can mention the research hypothesis and the null hypothesis. You must see whether it is included in introduction. If it is included in the introduction, you should not mention it separately because it will be a repetition. Next comes the material and methods. Material and methods mention briefly how did you do it. Is how did you undertake the study. So the first thing is the mention of the study design and study setting. If it is a clinical trial, mention that it is a clinical trial. If it is a cross-sectional study, mention that it was a cross-sectional study. Study setting is the actual place where the study was conducted, whether it was conducted in the hospital, whether the study was conducted in the employees of certain factory, or whether it was done in the community by house to house visits in the community and the participants. So that is the mention of the study settings. Then study duration, endpoint, and the reference period must be mentioned. Study duration is to when the study exactly started and when it ended, and what was the endpoint. In clinical trial, for example, the endpoint could be when all the subjects included in the study, the follow-up was complete. So that's the endpoint of the study. The reference period is important, especially when the studies are retrospective. Like for example, you want to know about the mortality because of a disease or morbidity because of a disease by a cross-sectional study. How far in the past you went? You undertook the study for the past 1 year. The information was asked for past 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. That is the reference period. The study duration is the actual time when the study started and ended, and the reference period is the period for which the information was obtained from the participants. That is the reference period. One should not confuse between the reference period and the study duration. Then defining the participants is a very important mention in the material and methods, and therein we mention the inclusion and exclusion criteria that decides the eligibility of the participants for participating in the study. So that is defining the participants or population, mentioning the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Sampling method is to be mentioned and is required to be mentioned, especially in the analytical studies and in the observational, cross-sectional or longitudinal studies. That is very important. So what sampling method you used? Just mentioning that it was a random method is not sufficient, because by mentioning the random, one may be confused. So whether it was a simple random method, whether it was a stratified random sampling, that must be mentioned. As far as the experimental study is concerned, allocation method is very important, and mention of allocation method in experimental study is important, and it must be mentioned in the material and methods. Whether the allocation was done by a lottery system, or whether it was by sealed packet method or any other method that you have used, that must be mentioned. The allocation method refers to as to how the selected participants uh, were divided into study group and into the control group. So mentioning that method is the allocation method. Sample size determination and the mentioning the method of the sample size calculation is important in the material and methods. So what were your assumptions in calculating the sample size? What was the alpha error? What was the beta error assumed? And what was the precision expected and assumed while calculating the sample size? One must give the formula used for calculating the sample size must be given, and the source of the formula must be given as a reference. If you have used any software for calculating the sample size, the appropriate reference of the software must be given in the text of the material and methods. Then comes the step of mentioning or enlisting the variables. It could be given in a tabular form. What were the primary variables? what was the demographic variables, what were the secondary variables. The primary variables are the variables mentioned in the research question. All other variables become secondary variables. So confounding variables, demographic variables are secondary variables. So you must make a list of a table wherein the list of the variables that are there in the study must be given. And for each variable, you must give the scale of measurement of the variable, whether it was a nominal scale variable, whether it was a ratio scale variable, whether it was a ordinal variable or the variable measured on ordinal scale, that must be mentioned. So mention the name of the variable, then the scale of the measurement of the variable in the next column, and the method of assessment of that variable in the third column. So that completes the enlisting of the variables. For example, if it is age, then age is a ratio scale variable. So you must mention age in the list. Then in the second column against the age, you must mention that it is a ratio variable, and the method of ascertainment could be mentioned whatever method you have used, whether it was ascertained by interview of the participants or whether it was ascertained with the help of certain records. So that can be mentioned. Hemoglobin could be a measure. So hemoglobin is a variable. Then the scale of measurement is a ratio scale variable, and the method of ascertainment is the Salis method. So that's the way you should go for each of the variable. Then the tools of measurement for each variable, they are mentioned in the enlisting of the variables. But if it is a new method, if it is a new method that you have used for certain variables, certain mention must be made in the material methods. So it deserves some mention in details as far as the new method is concerned. Otherwise, for all other methods for which the commonly used methods are only used, they can be mentioned in the table in which the variables are tabulated. Lastly, you should mention the statistical tests that were used in the analysis. Whether the multivariate analysis was used, and in multivariate analysis, what sort of multivariate analysis you have used, and what statistical tests were used for the ratio scale variables, and what statistical tests were used for nominal variables. That must be mentioned in the material and methods. Then comes the results. Some journals expect instead of results, they expect it in the subtitle as observations. So it could be results or observations. Therein you have to mention what did you find. In the text, you should mention as to what exactly you found. So therein the first table should be the profile of the participant, should be the first table. The participants are those who were included in the study. It could be study group and the control group. It could be in the case control study, it could be cases and the control group. In the study group, in the clinical trial, it could be the experimental group and the control group. So the profile of the participants in those groups must be given in the first table. So profile may contain the gender-wise profile, the age-wise profile, the severity of the disease in the two groups. So all these things come in the profile of the participants. So that should be the first table in the results. While mentioning the results, one should mention them object-wise in the chronological order. The results and the observations related to the first objective should be mentioned first, second objective should come next, and the third objective should come after the second objective. So that ensures that you are giving the results in a methodological manner. Otherwise, you may mix up the results and there may be confusion in the minds of the reader. So give the results objective-wise. They could be given in the tables and the figures and in the text. So the observation or the results can be given in the text form, they could be given in the tabular form or in the figures. They should be numbered appropriately as per the instructions given by the journal. Each table and the figure should have an appropriate title, and if required, there should be footnotes for each table. Then you should avoid the duplication of information. If the information is given in the tables, the same information should not be given in the figures. If the information is given in the figures, same information should be avoided in the tables. So this avoids the duplication, and therefore you can utilize the space that is given by the journal fruitfully by avoiding the duplication of the information in the tables and figures. Then in the table you can also mention the result of the statistical test. The table may involve application of the chi-square test. So the result of the statistical test can be given in the table itself. And in the text, then you may say that such and such table shows the result of the observations and the chi-square value as such and such and the probability was such and such. So that completes the discussion of that or the mentioning the result of that table. You must mention the number wherever the percentages or means are mentioned. You may say that there were 40% of the participants were males and 60% were females. But how much was the total number based on which the percentage was calculated? That must be given in the same table. Same thing with the means. The means may be mentioned, but the number on which by which the means is calculated must be given along with the percentages and means. You must mention the units for the quantitative data. There may be quantitative variables and the unit of measurement must be given. Like for hemoglobin, it may be in grams percentage. For height, it may be in centimeters. For weight, it could be in kilograms. So that units of the measurement for the variable mentioned in the table of the results must be mentioned. For the quantitative variables, again, the minimum and maximum values in the series of observations must be mentioned. So wherever the means are mentioned, therein you should mention the minimum and maximum values for the quantitative variables. You must also mention the 95% confidence interval for any statistic that is based on the sample. Any statistics, that is, if it is the mean, then you should mention the standard deviation and 95% confidence interval. If it is the percentage, there and again you should mention the 95% confidence interval for that percentage. That must be mentioned in the table itself. The discussion includes what are the implications of the findings. You have shown what were your findings, but what is the implication of these findings? That comes in the discussion. So are your findings different than the others? You may have found the prevalence of a certain disease which is very low as compared to the others, or it may be very high compared to the others. So that must be mentioned, and why, whether these findings are different from the others, and if they are different, how they are different, and why, what is the possibility of behind you getting the results that are different from others. So that must come in the discussion. Did you find any new thing that others did not find? You may have found in the clinical trial side effect of a drug that is not reported by others. So that could be mentioned. In fact, that should be the highlight of your study. So any side effect that you have found, any risk factor for a disease that has not been found by others. So that is the findings that should come in the discussion, and that is the finding that you found which others did not find. So discussion should revolve around such things also. And if so, the reasons behind it. If you have found certain new things, why it is that you have found the new thing and why others have not found. You may have included the pediatric age group, and because of which you have found the side effect. Others might have done the studies on adults only, and that's why you have found certain side effect, and therefore you can say that this is a side effect which is likely to be found in the children only. So that sort of mentioning should come in the discussion. What is the utility of your findings to the others? This is called as external validation. So you have done this study in certain study settings like in a hospital or in community. So what is the utility of this finding to others? Whether it will be useful, whether it will be replicable in the areas that they are working. So a mention of that must be there in the discussion. You must restrict the discussion to the findings only, your findings only. The discussion should revolve around your findings only and comparison of your findings and findings of the others who have done studies similar to you. So the discussion should revolve around this, and that only will see that the discussion is in the limited space. Otherwise, the discussion may occupy a very large space and the paper is likely to be rejected because it exceeded the limit of wordings given by the journal. Some journals may not require the summary in the end, but some journals expect the summary. So summary should be given, and the summary should include what are your important findings. You may enlist the important findings, and that should be the end of the summary. So what were your important findings? What were the important risk factors you found? What were the important side effects you found? Whether the new drug was found to be more effective than the established line of treatment. So such things should come in the summary. Summary should mention these. Many journals, as I said, do not expect summary to be given because it is already included in the abstract. The references, one must ensure as to what is the style of the referencing recommended by the journal. And these are the various styles of referencing: Vancouver style, Harvard style, American Medical Association citation style, American Psychological Association style, Chicago referencing style, International Committee of Medical Journal Editors style, the Modern Language Association style. So what is the referencing style recommended by the journal to which you are sending the article? So that you must see, and you must see that you are referencing, the citation of the referencing and enlisting of the referencing is as per the style recommended by the journal. In references, so these what the others have said about the topic is mentioned, and those references come in the references, and the references should be as per guideline of the journal. So there are two aspects of references. One is the citation of the references or quoting the reference in the text of your article, and second is the enlisting of the references in the end. The quoting the references in the text, for example, in Vancouver style, the quoting of the references is in the sequence of their appearance. So the first sequence, first reference appears, say, in introduction, so it is numbered 1 and it comes at serial number 1 in the list of the references. Second reference comes in, say, material and methods, then it receives the serial number 2, and in the enlisted references, in the list of the references, it comes at serial number 2. So that is the quoting the references in this sequence of the appearance in the Vancouver style, and it is referred to in the text as a superscript. So it appears, if the reference is, say, to be written as after at the superscript, it will appear at this place somewhere over here as a superscript, and the modern typing softwares will see that it is mentioned as a superscript once you instruct that it should be superscript. Next thing in the references is the enlisting the references, and in the Vancouver style, it is referred to the number in the serial number comes over here. Then comes the names of the authors. In the names of the authors, the surname comes first, and then the first and the middle name, and there is no full stop in between the first letter of the first name and the first letter of the middle name. No full stop. Then comes the comma. So like this, the authors' names are mentioned. Then comes the title of the paper mentioned in the references: Epidemiological Investigation of an Outbreak in the Entry Fever in a Village in Maharashtra. Then comes the full stop, and then comes the name of the journal, and this is the abbreviated name of the journal, and it is as per the style of the referencing. So the journal short form is mentioned. Then this 28 is the volume number of the journal. Then this number in the bracket 2 is the issue number. Then 117, this number is the first page number of this article which has appeared in the journal. So this is the first page, and this is the year of publication. So this is how the Vancouver styling of referencing goes. There are references, there are certain softwares which can help you in citing the references and enlisting the references. Then comes the acknowledgement. The last section of the paper is the acknowledgement, and it should mention the persons who have helped you in preparing the paper and completing the project. The first one should be the sponsors. The sponsors, those who have helped you financially in the project, the mention should be there. Then comes the ethics committee, and you can give the reference of the later number, that the ethics committee of your institution has approved this project, wide letter number so and so, that can be given. The institutional heads mentioned should also be there because the administrative permissions were given by the institutional head. Then one should mention the other persons whose help requires to be mentioned, like the uh, persons from other departments like microbiology department or pathology department or radiology department. They might have helped your study, so their mention must be there in the acknowledgement. The last and the very important thing, and which is usually not mentioned, is the conflict of interest. Whether there is any conflict of interest between the authors and the subject topic. So some of the authors may have the conflict of interest with the topic covered in the paper. So that must be mentioned. And the journals, some journals expect it to be mentioned separately. If not, you should mention it in the acknowledgement. There are certain guidelines for preparing the papers which are internationally accepted, and it is better you prepare your paper as per the guidelines of these sites. So for the descriptive study, for the case control study, and for cohort study, there are strobe guidelines, and you should go to this website and see what are these guidelines. And if you prepare your paper as per these guidelines, then it will be an accurate and good paper, or the design or the construct of the paper will be very good. For clinical trial, it is the consort guidelines, and this is the website of the consort wherein you can find out the consort guidelines. If it is the evaluation of the diagnostic test, they are the star D guidelines, and this is the website address of the star D. So before preparing the paper, you should go to these websites depending on your study design and find out what is expected over there. What does these guidelines give you? They give you the checklist of the items. So you can go on checking the items, and your paper then becomes very comprehensive. It also gives you certain flow charts which can be incorporated in your paper, and incorporating the flow charts will ensure that your study is prepared according to the guideline. So this is a consort flow chart given by the consort organization, and if you include this and fill in the required information over here, the referees of the journal will know that your paper has been prepared as per the consort guideline. So similar flow charts are available for the case control studies. Similar flow charts are available for the cohort studies in the respective guidelines. One must use these flow charts and adapt them as per your study design and as per your specific study, and the numbers then only vary. The numbers which are mentioned over here would only vary, and in randomization, for example, you might have randomized the persons in the 3 group, then the third group comes over here. So like this, this chart can be adopted for your specific study, and if it is given and if it is shown in the paper itself, it will also reduce the space in the text. So the number of the words that is required to be used in the text will be reduced if you mention these things in the flowchart. Then some additional information is essential to be given to you people. One is the many journals now expect an online submission. So you should go to the website of the journal. Many journals are now on journal on website. So you should keep ready the files, the computer files of the text, the computer files of the tables, the computer files of the figures, because they are required to be overloaded. They are required to be uploaded in the journal on the journal's website. The author's consent form is also given by the journals. You should download that, obtain the signature of all authors on the consent form. The copyright form is also given. You are required to obtain the signature of all authors on the copyright form also. And you should keep this form ready. You can take a photograph of the consent form. You can take the photograph of this copyright form, and you can upload them. So that is about the online submission of the journal article. As far as the references is concerned, it's a very complicated issue, and people may find it very difficult initially. So for them, these are certain softwares which are available, Mendeley and Zotero, that help you for managing the references while preparing the paper. So these you should have at least one of these two, Zotero or Mendeley, and these are free softwares. They are freely available on the internet. So you can download and install these softwares on your computer, and then they will help you immensely for managing the references for your publication. So, friends, that finishes this presentation. And if you have got any queries related to this presentation or related to any other presentation by me, you can contact me on this email ID, drapkulkarni@gmail.com. Thank you very much.